is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Paul Barber.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Unacceptably slow. The World Health Organization criticizes Europe for its COVID-19 vaccination campaign.
A third lockdown to battle a third wave. France extends restrictions nationwide as infections surge across Europe.
More needs to be done. That's the pledge from the UK Prime Minister following criticism of a government report on racial inequality.
Touted as a once-in-a-generation investment, Joe Biden unveils his $2 trillion plan to bolster the US economy.
And we'll head inside Hollywood's historic Chinese movie palace as it reopens after a year-long shutdown.
Europe's vaccine rollout is unacceptably slow. That's the stern warning issued by the World Health Organization, which says COVID-19 infections in the region are increasing in every age group except those aged over 80. Delays in administering shots are raising concern the pandemic could be prolonged as cases of variants continue to spread. Currently, only 10% of Europe's population has received one vaccine dose. After one dose, the chance of becoming seriously ill with the virus is dramatically reduced. Just 4% of the population has received both vaccine doses. 27 countries in the region are in partial or full lockdowns. The WHO has urged people to stick to the rules, particularly ahead of upcoming religious holidays like Easter and Ramadan.
Well, let's speak to Stuart Smith, who's in Brussels for us. So, Stuart, a bleak assessment from the WHO of the situation in Europe.
Yes, and we learned on Wednesday after a meeting of EU ambassadors the latest projections for how the vaccine rollout is going to go, and it's not great. 45 to 60% of people will be vaccinated by the end of June. That's the estimate for most countries within Europe, meaning that vaccination is unlikely to be the source of any holistic solution to the COVID-19 epidemic within Europe. The reason for those low figures of vaccination is most likely due to a lack of doses in the continent. And the reason for that is related to a lack of, or the European Union exporting a lot of its doses. So that means that as well as this latest wave of COVID-19, which is more transmissible and more deadly with new variants, hospital admissions are increasing. Many hospitals are reaching capacity in European Union states, and that's led a lot of countries to impose more restrictions and even in some cases lockdowns. Here in Belgium, 2 weeks ago, new rules were imposed, and one of those is the source of major contention today. One rule says that people travelling on trains to the most popular tourist destinations must only sit on window seats to try and reduce capacity in trains. However, the head of Belgium's national railway company says that plan is completely unmanageable, and the government either needs to relax this rule or force people not to take those routes at all. It says if that is not done, then the railway company may have to be the ones that turn people away.
Belgians are gearing up for another Easter holiday under COVID-19 restrictions. Unlike last year, people can travel domestically wherever they want, as long as they're back home by 10 p.m. That's made routes to Belgium's coast incredibly popular, but national train company SNCB fears it won't be able to cope with the boom in demand while seating capacity is restricted. And so an ultimatum to the government: lift the measures or restrict travel to the popular destinations by law. And if the government fails to decide, then the railway company may be forced to close the lines.
This conflict between freedom and safety was meant to be over by now. In February, Belgians were expecting restaurants and cafes would be open and children back at school.
But a slow vaccination campaign in the face of a resurgent virus means attempts to open up have stalled, and people are growing increasingly weary.
It would have been better if we closed everything for a month, like we did last year in March, instead of these tiny measures which are useless and end up extending the lockdown more than anything.
I think that, especially with this kind of weather, I think it's high time that the government starts relaxing the measures.
On Wednesday, a Brussels court shot down those rules, ordering the government to end all its coronavirus measures within a month or face a fine. The government's been using executive orders to close establishments, limit gatherings and prevent people leaving the country, but judges say the current legal basis isn't good enough. The Minister of Justice says rules will remain and he will appeal, while work continues on a new pandemic law, which should provide the necessary legal grounding. While Belgium's restrictions are ruled out of order, in neighbouring France they've only got stricter, as tight rules in the north are extended across the rest of the country.
We have decided to extend to all areas in mainland France the measures that were already in place in the 19 departments most affected by the epidemic. These new measures will apply from Sunday morning for 4 weeks. This choice to act on a national scale is explained by the fact that for the last 10 days or so, the epidemic has been spreading in nearly all of the country.
Non-essential shops must close, there'll be a 10-kilometre limit on non-essential travel, and pupils will not return to school after the break. That's on top of an existing countrywide 7 p.m. curfew. For France's 67 million residents, the long Easter weekend is on hold once again.
President Emmanuel Macron says that he has made mistakes during this pandemic. One of those he described as the European Union being naive in letting so many vaccine doses be exported from the European Union. And another, that issue hasn't been sorted out. And another issue still to resolve is the internal allocation of vaccines within the EU, a batch of 10 million doses currently unaccounted for, and EU ambassadors trying to work out how that should be fairly doled out to countries which in the EU are all desperate for more vaccines wherever they can get them from.
OK, Stuart Smith in Brussels, many thanks.
Dr. Siddhartha Datta is the WHO's European Programme Manager for Vaccine Preventable Disease and Immunisation. He told me that the rollout of vaccines was unequal across the continent.
The important integral part of this entire vaccine rollout is to understand what are the in-country specific issues which are plugging this rollout to be uniform across the region. The last part I would also try to bring it up here, while we are talking about 47 of our 54 member states and territories who have rolled out their vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, there are several countries still who haven't received any vaccine doses yet.
And what are the risks associated with Europe's slow vaccine rollout, and how worried are you about new variants?
Yeah, so I think one of the important elements of this vaccine rollout across all countries in the region and a much faster pace than what we see now will be critical. We are concerned with the pace of rollout. What is important also for us to remember that the slow rollout of the vaccines will also contribute to the prolonging of the pandemic in the WHO European region, but also elsewhere, but also the occurrence of the variants that can emerge because of this slow rollout.
Now, of course, both Easter and Ramadan are coming up. People traditionally move around the country, visit their families. How much of a risk does this kind of movement cause in terms of the spread of the virus?
So we understand that this is a festive time, and these moments also, people look forward to these moments where they can meet their families, friends, and the loved ones. So we understand that these gatherings can happen, and the gatherings in this type of festive occasions also provides that fertile ground, if not all precautionary measures are being taken for the spread of the virus. The virus hasn't changed much since the start, since last 1 year. The tested public health measures remain, and they have proved beneficial and proved useful to contain the virus in several past events or several past months.
The WHO says that Europe's vaccine rollout is unacceptably slow, but you're also urging rich European nations to share vaccine doses. How can both aims be achieved?
The pace of rollout should be that every country, irrespective of their income level or purchasing power, need to protect these two vulnerable groups. The healthcare workers who are saving us or who keep the health system running is extremely critical, and the others who have, looking at the disease epidemiology of COVID-19, these population groups of more than 65 years are either getting the severe diseases or dying. When we talk about people being vaccinated everywhere and countries sharing their doses, it doesn't mean that countries should leave behind everything and start sharing the vaccine with others. When each and every country have taken care of the healthcare workers, social workers, people more than 65, these vulnerable population groups, that is a time when countries need to start looking outwards. Is only if we share, only if we also be concerned about the healthcare workers in other countries who are also at the forefront in the pandemic, then only this whole sharing is caring principle will become in reality.
Lockdown in the UK has been especially hard on those with pre-existing health conditions. For them, the pandemic has meant an extended period of shielding, unable to see friends and family members. But the government guidance telling them to stay at home is coming to an end. Catherine Drew went to South East England to speak with one of the 4 million people looking forward to living again.
For some, this day has been a long time coming.
Officially free.
1 year ago, the clinically vulnerable were told by their doctors to shield from COVID-19. Now they no longer need to do so. One of those is 54-year-old Chris Olivotos, an award-winning cameraman. He's braved war zones and other hostile environments, but a kidney condition meant he had to take cover from COVID-19.
You know, when you're in a hostile environment, you sort of know what to look out for. You know the enemy. You know where you could and what you could and what you can't do. But this is an invisible enemy. You just, you can get it anywhere.
Now, Chris and the roughly 4 million people classed as clinically vulnerable in England and Wales must observe lockdown measures like everyone else, but can now enjoy simple pleasures like going for a walk. For many, it's been a tough year.
So the year's been really difficult. I couldn't do frequent blood tests and keep on top of my condition. So my kidney function declined rapidly. And I almost went into complete kidney failure. On top of that, I lost my job at the same time.
Those who have been shielding in Scotland and Northern Ireland are expected to be granted the same level of freedoms later in the month. The change in the guidance to the clinically vulnerable comes as outdoor socialising and sport has resumed across England. With over 30 million adults now immunised, the roadmap for opening up will see non-essential shops, gyms and hairdressers reopen from April the 12th. It's good news for many, although the government continues to urge caution. Meanwhile, the Welsh government has given further guidance on its reopening plan, with outdoor hospitality and attractions allowed from the end of the month. For many people like Chris, there is relief their shielding has come to an end and hope for a less socially isolated future. Catherine Drew, CGTN, Erith in Kent.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says more needs to be done to tackle racism following a government report on ethnic and racial inequality. The report says the UK is performing better than most other white majority countries, but critics say it fails to acknowledge continued structural racism. Let's talk to our correspondent Nicole Johnson, who's in Westminster. So, Nicole, the report didn't touch upon how ethnic communities have fared during the pandemic. How has COVID-19 impacted them?
Well, there have been a number of national reports into this, and they've found that COVID-19 has not only exposed racial inequalities across the UK, but it's also worsened them. So many of these black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, they live in multi-generational households, poorer communities. They're doing high-risk, low-paying jobs, and so they're particularly vulnerable and susceptible to COVID-19. Not only that, there's been a big problem also in some of these communities with vaccine hesitancy. And the doctors are saying that they should in fact be prioritised for receiving the vaccine. But in the last couple of months, though, that vaccine hesitancy has been improving, and in the black community, there's been a 50% drop in the number of people saying that they're reluctant to have a COVID-19 vaccine.
And Nicole, a number of Asian communities in the US say that racism and violence towards them has surged during the pandemic. So what's the situation here in the UK?
Well, early on in the pandemic, 1 year ago, there were reports that there had been a 300% increase in hate crime against people from either a Chinese, East Asian or Southeast Asian background. Since then, there have been a number of isolated attacks against people from those communities, and also healthcare workers from the Filipino community in the UK have said that they have received abuse and sort of hate speech as well. So it's certainly an issue here, but the government says that it wants to try and get on top of it, and this week it released a report into racism, as you'll see in this story.
Last summer, hundreds of people gathered for Black Lives Matter protests in cities across the UK. Anger over the death of George Floyd in the US had ignited a movement. Now a review set up by the British government claims the UK no longer has institutional racism.
There are disparities. We recognise that, and the disparities that we've looked at are in education, in employment, crime and policing, and health. However, the interesting thing about this report is that it doesn't find those disparities landing in racism.
The report found that children from black, ethnic and minority communities do as well at school, or better, than white students. And the pay gap between white people and minorities has fallen to 2.3%.
If you look at it, they've come forward with, I think, about 24 interesting ideas to promote equality, of opportunity.
But not everyone agrees with how this report is looking at racism, especially those who protested last year.
We didn't march last year to be told that our experiences aren't real, that we're essentially making things up, that racism can't exist when thousands and thousands of people march the street.
Others say the report fails to acknowledge that there is structural racism.
People said at the time when he commissioned the report that it was a whitewash, to use a slightly unfortunate phrase, and that's what it's turned out to be, you know. And the argument that institutional racism doesn't exist is just absurd.
As for COVID-19, in the UK, coronavirus has disproportionately affected ethnic and black communities.
One reason for this is they're more likely to live in deprived neighbourhoods, have poorer health and work in frontline jobs with insecure pay. And that makes it difficult to isolate if you catch the virus.
Now, with vaccines being rolled out, some people in these communities are reluctant to take it up, leading to fears the disease could become endemic in racially diverse and deprived areas. But the government says all this has nothing to do with racism.
So racial inequality has become a big issue here in the UK. The government is under a great deal of pressure to do something about it. But as we heard from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, it seems quite unclear about exactly what it should do.
Nicole, thank you. Nicole Johnson reporting there from Westminster.
Still to come on CGTN. Oil production is on the agenda. After months of cuts, the OPEC Plus group looks set to increase production.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN.
Don't forget you can sign up to our daily newsletter. We bring you all the top business headlines straight to your inbox. So sign up for free at this address. CGTN. See the difference.
back to Global Business Europe, live from London. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can also find us on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as CGTN.com and the CGTN app. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create the world's strongest and most resilient economy. That's how US President Joe Biden announced his $2 trillion infrastructure and job spending plan as he looks to bolster the United States' post-pandemic economy. It's the largest American jobs investment since World War II and includes funding for transport, housing, manufacturing, job training and greener energy.
Well, our correspondent John Terretts joins us now live from New York. Hi there, John. This seems like history in the making.
Well, hey, Paul. Hey, Robin. You know, in one sense it is, and many people here are comparing it to the New Deal. That's not the Green New Deal, you understand. That's something else that Joe Biden is promoting. But the New Deal itself, as promoted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the 32nd president of the United States between 1933 and 1939. Now, that was all about public works and financial reform and new regulations and that sort of thing. And this appears to be another attempt to distance us all from the idea of trickle-down economics as espoused in the 80s by President Reagan here and by Margaret Thatcher in London. Joe Biden has said several times he's all about changing that he doesn't think if you enrich and empower the rich that it will trickle down to the rest of us lower down. So this is all about crumbling infrastructure in the main, $2 trillion worth of spending. Biden says it's a one-time injection of cash that will boost the U.S. economy over the next 8 years to a decade. Take a listen.
It's not a plan that tinkers around the edges. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America, unlike anything we've seen or done since we built the interstate highway system and the space race decades ago. We have to move now, because I'm convinced that if we act now, in 50 years, people are going to look back and say, this was the moment that America won the future.
Well, Joe Biden says the $2 trillion of spending, if it all goes through, will create job growth in America, economic growth for the country, and help U.S. businesses to compete better internationally on the international stage. Paul?
So what will all this money buy, John?
Good question. He was speaking in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a city, is known as the City of Bridges. And I'm not kidding about this. Everywhere you look in Pittsburgh, there is a bridge. Seriously, there's that many of them. Now, many bridges in the United States, unfortunately, are in danger of crumbling. According to the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, I mean, who knew that there was such an organization, but there is. In March of 2019, they said that 47,000 bridges in America were structurally deficient and that 600 of them were structurally deficient here in the New York area. So the money is going to go, among other things, into roads and bridges, highways, which, believe it or not, is different, ports and airports, the electricity grid, water systems, clean energy, of course, and broadband, because remarkably, only as about 3% of Americans still don't have broadband even today. Now, how is he going to pay for all this? Well, the plan is to raise business and corporation tax. Corporation tax is currently around 21%, will rise to 28%. Republicans on the other side of the ticket say, look, this is a recipe for stagnation and a recipe for decline. And somebody on television here this morning worked out that only about 3% of this $2 trillion is actually directly going into improving infrastructure. But that is the U.S. system, I'm afraid. There's a lot of what they call pork here.
Oh, we've lost our signal to New York there and John Terretts, but I think we got the gist. Thank you very much indeed, John Terrett there.
The CEO of Boeing says the US approach to China needs modifying, as it could have serious adverse effects. Dave Calhoun has urged the Biden administration to keep human rights and other disputes separate from trade relations with Beijing. He also warned that European rival Airbus could make gains if the US plane maker were locked out of China. It's taken a long time working out just the right formula, but China has created the world's biggest chemical company. Sinochem Group and China National Chemical Corp, or ChemChina, have merged and made a $150 billion giant firm. The deal has been in the works since 2016. Google plans to partially reopen its US offices this month, with staff able to return in a limited capacity. The announcement follows Microsoft, Facebook and Uber's plans to return to offices in the coming months. Google will fully reopen in September, and employees who want to work remotely for more than 14 days a year will need to formally apply. UK retailer Next says its profits more than halved in the year to the end of January. The clothing and homeware firm says it's expecting a consumer rebound and has raised its profits forecast for the next 6 months. But it warns that the battle to keep high street stores operating is far from over. The OPEC Plus group has reached a preliminary deal to gradually ease oil production cuts from next month. The reductions were brought in to reduce oversupply and protect the price of oil as consumption dropped during lockdown. Let's get more now from Jim Stenman, who is in Dubai. So, Jim, what details are we going to be able to see in this agreement?
So today's meeting of OPEC Plus, a virtual one yet again given global travel restrictions, started mid-afternoon Vienna time. Delegates were ahead of the session said to be deliberating two key options: rolling over cuts or raising oil output. The gathering of the world's key oil producers, designed to agree on policies from May and onwards, comes only days after the reopening of the Suez Canal, easing global supply chains there, and as France enters another lockdown in an effort to push back a third wave of COVID-19, which we're seeing globally. Well, we can now reveal that OPEC Plus has reached a preliminary deal to gradually ease cuts from May. The group is doing so by 350 barrels per day that month, 350 again in June, and then probably 400,000 barrels per day in July. Things can change, obviously. The OPEC Plus agreement follows a phone call by U.S. President Joe Biden to OPEC leader Saudi Arabia. Interestingly enough, continuing a practice by his predecessor, Donald Trump, requesting oil be kept affordable, a message also reiterated by U.S. Energy Secretary in a separate conversation with her Saudi counterpart. These discussions are thought to be the first call by a U.S. official to Riyadh since the current administration came into office.
And Jim, what does this deal tell us about OPEC's economic outlook?
Well, I think the economic outlook is one of great uncertainty. Things appear to be looking up somewhat in parts of the world based on this agreement. But the question really is whether OPEC Plus members will be able to agree on future cuts. And this will very much depend on the economic outlook in their own countries. So where do we go next with the pandemic? Well, ahead of this meeting, some members had expressed frustration, according to Reuters, that non-oil members, Russia and Kazakhstan, supported a broad rollover of existing cuts, while also requesting small output increases for themselves. So again, the ongoing pandemic continues to cloud the global economic outlook, especially as several European countries have now re-entered lockdowns, despite some successful efforts in the US and in the UK.
Okay, Jim Stenman in Dubai, many thanks.
China has hit back at Britain after it pushed G7 allies to get tough on Beijing over its trade practices. UK Trade Minister Liz Truss says the World Trade Organization should be reformed. She says the rules no longer reflect China's status as an economic superpower. China says the UK is seeking to maintain economic dominance.
Western powers are the main stipulators of WTO rules. It's their common practice to use the rules to reinforce their hegemony and contain developing countries. When China joined the WTO, they refused to lower standards for China. Now they will make new rules especially for China to make sure they are always on the winning side. This is really unfair and needs to change.
Well, calls for reform of the WTO centre on the organisation's dispute settlement system. CGTN asked its Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, about her vision for change.
Well, it's going to be an extremely tough issue to deal with. The US had a lot of problems with the appellate body and with the dispute settlement system. And so now we have a new US administration in place that wants to return to multilateralism. So it would be good to listen to their views and what they have to say about the reform of the appellate body. But it's not just the US that has problems. Some least developed countries have also said to me that they have problems with the appellate body, that it is difficult for them to access, it's costly for them to access. If you look at the statistics on who uses the dispute settlement system, very few developing countries. So the reform must include the views of those developing country members, the view of the US as to the reform, and of course other members like the EU, Japan, everyone, including China.
So what kind of role do you think China is playing in the multilateral trading system in the world? And what are your expectations of China for a world that's after the pandemic?
China's rebound is very important for the world, and China recovered very fast from the pandemic, even though it started in China, but China put in policies fast enough that led to the economy rebounding, and now growth is expected, at rates that are much higher than other countries. So that role of the engine of growth and trade is very important. So China in the WTO plays a very important role. Of course, there are issues related to trade for all members, and including with China, concerns that other members of the WTO have about China's trade and China's concern about trade with other WTO members. But all in all, I would say that it's a very active and big force at WTO.
You're watching CGTN. Coming up, protesters in Myanmar mark 2 months since the military takeover. We'll have the latest on those fleeing the violence.
Patient after patient after patient. They take a long time to get better. They're the sickest patients we've ever seen.
It's a race against time, because we can all see the threat that our NHS faces, the pressure it's under.
We're dealing with something we knew very little about.
Europe's first 2 epicentres in February have received their first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine.
Another day, another grim milestone for the UK in its fight against COVID-19. 100,000 people have now lost their lives after contracting the virus.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very busy when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Paul Barber. The headlines again. A third lockdown to battle a third wave. France orders further restrictions as infections surge across Europe. The UK Prime Minister says more needs to be done to tackle racism following criticism of a government report on ethnic and racial inequality. And the World Health Organization has criticised Europe for its COVID-19 vaccination campaign, calling the rollout unacceptably slow.
Let's get more now on the COVID situation in Europe and the problems with its vaccination programme. And joining us from Paris is Tomasz Michalski, Associate Professor for the Economics Department at HEC Paris Business School. Great to have you with us on the programme, Tomasz. So let's start with the state of the EU vaccine rollout. Only 16% of the population has received the jab, compared with 52% in the UK. So what do you think went wrong?
Well, there were a couple of things. First of all, it was up to the European Commission to negotiate the contracts, and it turned out that the superstructure was not ready. So there were various other issues related to Brexit. For example, the agency that is dealing with health issues in the EU was moving from London to Amsterdam. So there was a little bit of a mess. But then the other thing is that they treated this rollout a little bit like a long-term procurement contract. I would compare it with the hapless bargaining over and over again, the F-22 procurement in the U.S. Each state wanted to have a particular stake in this, and here in the European case, what was pretty much crucial, for example, small states, they were afraid that certain countries are going to benefit more than others from these vaccine contracts, especially Germany or France, because those were also the ones that had companies that potentially would deliver the vaccine. So there were loads of tensions. On the other hand, in itself, the idea to negotiate together makes a lot of sense, because smaller players like Slovakia or Lithuania, in general, tiny countries in the world scene would have tough time to get very good deals with vaccine companies.
Well, I want to turn, if we can, for a moment to France, where you're based. How bad is the current situation, and what's the thinking behind the latest lockdown measures announced?
So the situation is here measured, how dire it is. It's measured by what is the strain on the health system? What is the capacity to get more, to have free beds and respirators for potentially COVID-stricken people? Now, in some areas like Ile-de-France, which is here in the heart of the country, where 1/3 of GDP is being created, you actually have now a situation where the capacity is reached to 100% in those terms. So some of the sick are being transferred to other regions. And this drives the main preoccupation. So if the health system is unable to cope, we need additional measures to stop the virus. And this is what's being done at the very moment during the lockdown, in the hope that at the same time you're going to have the number of the vaccinated that is going to increase. And with time, this tension is going to be lowered.
OK, Tomasz Michalski from the HEC Paris Business School. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
The German capital, Berlin, will introduce a nighttime ban on gatherings from Friday and reduce the number of children at nursery from next week. Calls are growing for tighter restrictions to be imposed nationwide to combat the rising number of infections. Ryan Thompson reports from Frankfurt.
Well, as we head into Easter weekend, many Germans say that they are still planning to see friends and family over the 5-day holiday, despite the number of new coronavirus infections in Germany rising more and more each day. The warning lights are flashing across the country, but there's been little action so far to confront the third wave of the pandemic, which threatens to be the most severe. There are new calls from Germany's intensive care doctors who specifically want a strict 2-week lockdown to hopefully prevent what could be a difficult situation in hospitals in just a few weeks' time. About 1,000 people have wound up in ICU beds since the middle of March, and projections suggest that the absolute limit will be reached in less than 4 weeks. Now, the Intensive Care Association says the path forward needs to include compulsory tests at schools and faster vaccinations. But as you may remember, Germany's inoculation campaign remains sluggish, and there's frustration that some vaccination centers are closing on Friday, Sunday, and Monday because they are public holidays. That's on top of complications from the government's decision to suspend vaccinations with the AstraZeneca jab in people under 60. The Health Minister Jens Spahn addressed that a bit earlier.
Wir erwarten für das zweite Quartal.
We expect some 15 million doses of AstraZeneca in the second quarter, and I'm certain that there will be plenty of people willing to take the AstraZeneca shot. Its protection is good. The one downside does not outrule the positive effect.
Now, though that may seem to be a long way off, the health minister promises that the month of April will be a turning point for Germany's vaccination campaign. Inoculations will begin at doctors' offices, but potentially more crucially, the number of vaccine doses being delivered will increase dramatically, and that includes millions of shots of the Johnson & Johnson single-shot vaccine. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
Australia has missed its vaccine target by 85%. Figures show that by the end of March, around 670,000 people had been given their first jab. The government's target was 4 million. Greg Navarro explains what's causing the shortfall.
Well, the simple answer is that the number of vaccines needed to reach that target haven't made it to the people who administer those vaccines. In fact, the government's fallen short of its goal set earlier this year by about 3.4 million people, and the goal of vaccinating the entire population of 25 million plus by the end of October also appears in doubt at this point. Now, there are several factors at play here in a country reportedly with one of the highest rates of vaccine purchase per capita of any country in the world. One surrounds the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's the vaccine that the majority of us will receive here, the majority of the 25 million plus. The exports from Europe were blocked earlier this month. There were countries concerned that they didn't have enough to vaccinate their own citizens. Now, many of those fears played out. Vaccinations did resume being imported to the country. In the meantime, though, Australia has actually set up an AstraZeneca vaccination process here, production here in Australia, in fact, in the city of Melbourne. And the problem is that the number of doses being produced at the moment certainly fell short of what the government projected they would do as well. The third and final reason is the distribution process here doesn't involve vaccination hubs. It involves general practitioner doctors, and enough have signed up, apparently, according to states and territories, but they're complaining that they haven't received enough vaccinations to be able to distribute them and meet those targets. As you can imagine, both the states and territories and the federal government are at odds over this. The federal government saying states and territories are stockpiling vaccinations. States and territories saying they needed to do so because, remember, the vaccines being given in this country, you need 2 doses over a certain amount of time.
Now, are you getting enough shut-eye? It's estimated a third of people worldwide get less than the recommended 7 hours sleep a night. That's a cost to the economy through lost productivity and increased risk of accidents. So what countries are getting the right amount? Head to our website at europe.cgtn.com.
A Hong Kong court has convicted 7 prominent pro-democracy activists of unauthorised assembly during protests in 2019. They include media tycoon Jimmy Lai and the barrister Martin Lee. Sentencing is scheduled for April the 16th. The maximum prison sentence is 5 years. China and Malaysia will set up a committee to boost economic ties. Foreign ministers of the 2 countries have also agreed to cooperate on vaccines and facilitating travel. China has said it supports Southeast Asian leaders' efforts to mediate the crisis in Myanmar. The girlfriend of George Floyd has told a jury how they both struggled with opioid addiction. Floyd, who was black, died while being arrested by Derek Chauvin, a white police officer in Minneapolis. Chauvin's lawyers argue the cause of death was an overdose of fentanyl. A mass shooting in the city of Orange in California has left at least 4 people dead, including a child. The suspect shooter is also among the dead. Police say it's unclear if the suspect's wounds were self-inflicted. New York has become the 15th US state to legalize recreational marijuana. Anyone over 21 can now possess up to 85 grams. People won't be allowed to consume cannabis in schools, workplaces or in cars. And Italy has banned cruise ships from docking in central Venice. They will have to stop at the city's industrial port until a long-term solution can be found. Critics say the ships are an eyesore and safety hazards.
Myanmar's deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi has been charged with violating a colonial-era official secrets law. That's on top of charges already filed following February's military takeover against her elected government. Protests continue against Suu Kyi's detention, with people taking to the streets to mark 2 months since the unrest began. More than 500 civilians have been killed in demonstrations against army rule. Villagers living along Thailand's border with Myanmar say they are on the front line of the ongoing unrest as people try to flee the violence. Martin Lowe reports.
Restaurant owner Mi has had to flee fighting before. She says she's heard shooting across the border and wonders if it's time to pack her bags again. Directly beneath this Myanmar army post, the Salween River is all that separates Myanmar from Thailand. The fact thousands of refugees were able to reach Thailand just days ago shows how easy it is to cross. As Myanmar's strife continues, people who've made a peaceful life on the Thai side of the river, including a number from Myanmar who fled past violence, fear they too could be in danger. This tiny village is one of a number on the front line should fighting spill over the border. Some people have already closed businesses and left the area. There's already been a battle between the Myanmar army and an armed militia just over this river border. People on this side, to whom conflict in Myanmar is no stranger, are now on high alert.
In the past, bullets have landed on the Thailand side. If the war comes again, I will move. I'm scared of what might happen.
This Myanmar woman moved to the village to escape past fighting.
I moved away from war before. Now I'm frightened again.
The Karen National Union, the militia which controls the Myanmar side here, says government troops were advancing towards them. No one knows if a temporary ceasefire announced by the military will hold. It was airstrikes on KNU territory that sparked the refugee exodus to Thailand. Many are calling on the more than a dozen ethnic militias to join forces to support those protesting the military takeover and confront the Myanmar army. Martin Lowe, CGTN, Mae Sam Leb on the Thai-Myanmar border.
Still to come here on CGTN. As the world's most valuable brand turns 45, we'll look at the secrets behind Apple's success.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Apple is celebrating its 45th birthday. The company launched as a computer maker on April the 1st, 1976, and has since grown into the world's most valuable brand. So what's the key to its longevity and success? I asked longtime Apple analyst Gene Munster for an insight.
I think what's been most impressive and one of the biggest ingredients for Apple's success is the company's ability to move on from a successful product. And they internally refer to that as killing their golden geese and to create bigger products ultimately. That mentality of never resting, always trying to advance is something that has served the company well. If you think back at how mobile devices and services have replaced what was the core product, the Mac product, now just 12% of Apple's revenue, I think that is representative of a culture of innovation. I think that is really what has allowed this company to stand out. Another aspect around this, too, when you think about the success of the iPod, at the time it had gone from nowhere to just over half of their revenue over a 5-year period. And when they announced the iPhone, they knew that that would be ultimately the end of the iPod, which today is less than 0.5% of revenue. It's those types of behaviors that are going to allow it to be successful in the future as the company moves into augmented reality, for example.
And the company has a strong relationship with China, both in terms of manufacturing and as a market for sales. Do you see that continuing to be a key market?
Undoubtedly, China is going to be an important part of Apple's future for the production of the devices, and separately, just the raw size of the growth opportunity. China remains, in my opinion, the biggest economic opportunity for growth globally over the next decade. And so, yes, Apple is going to continue to play a role. It's about 15% of Apple's business. It has sporadic growth rates. Some quarters it's down, other quarters it's up significantly. The most recent quarter was up significantly. I do see over the next decade, not just with Apple, but with a lot of companies starting to diversify where some of their manufacturing happens. And you'll hear more headlines, hear more stories about them bringing production to other places in the world. But I don't think it changes the substance that the majority of Apple products a decade from today will still be manufactured in China.
And we've seen so many innovations from Apple over the years. What do you think is next? What new venture might we see in the future?
That's the most exciting and most dangerous of my exercises. I've been wrong in the past, predicted Apple was going to come out with a TV, was famously wrong on that prediction. So it taught me a good lesson that what Apple is working on today won't necessarily see the light of day. But I can say Apple's working on two core initiatives. One is around augmented reality. This is the ability to take the real world around you and overlay digital images. Typically, it's through some form of wearables. Tim Cook has said that we're going to look back and marvel at what augmented reality is. We're probably going to see some form of glasses from Apple that are AR related in the next few years. That's a massive new opportunity. Really, the future of device mobile computing is going to be augmented reality. And the second is what they're going to do around transportation and mobility.
Hollywood's iconic TCL Chinese Theatre has reopened a year after the pandemic took hold. It first opened its doors nearly 100 years ago. Now, a raft of measures have been put in place to keep cinema goers safe. Here's Greg Lafredi.
For the reopening of the TCL Chinese Theatre, directors of Godzilla, Kong Skull Island, Godzilla King of the Monsters, and Godzilla vs. Kong cut the red ribbon in the courtyard. Adam Wingard, whose film Godzilla vs. Kong will be the first film shown at the theater, looked forward to a fresh round of fun in the historic structure.
It's been such a depressing year, 2020, and coming into 2021, that I think it's just time for us to be able to just turn our brains off and let a big Hollywood popcorn spectacle just do the work for us. And, you know, it's really just about having fun and, you know, cutting loose and just being with a group of friends and family and strangers, all having the same experience on the big screen. And, you know, like I said, just having fun.
The theater will space guests apart with plexiglass between seats and will constantly sanitize between screenings.
Inside the auditorium, between show times, we have disinfectant foggers. So in between each show, we go through and we sanitize fog The seats, the armrests, the rails, everything as a high touch point area. It's all disinfected between show times. And even out here in the forecourt, the handprints. We use a fogger out here as well, too, to help disinfect the handprints.
The TCL Chinese Theater was first opened in 1927 and was originally called Grauman's Chinese Theater. It's positioned in the center of the Hollywood Walk of Fame, where celebrities cement their place in Hollywood with hand and feet ceremonies. Greg Lafredi, CGTN.
Shanghai is celebrating all things coffee this week. Boasting record numbers of coffee shops, China's biggest city has well and truly fallen for caffeine culture. Yang Chengxi reports.
Coffee shops. They're everywhere in Shanghai. There are more than 8,000 of them here, thanks to the fact that it's now the Chinese mainland's most modern financial center, with an army of middle-class consumers. Not to mention its early history as a trade port with the West. That's why it's the first stop of many international coffee chains' foray into the Chinese market, all wanting to replicate the smashing success of Starbucks.
During the Shanghai Coffee Culture Week, Starbucks is hosting a series of workshops at its Shanghai flagship store.
We've invited several coffee contest champions to share their coffee-making skills tonight. When I first joined Starbucks, people mostly ordered regular drinks like latte. But now more people are interested in our pour-over coffee and other higher-end products. More younger customers want to sit at our bar and have discussions with our baristas.
Coffee drinkers in China are getting more sophisticated. The trend is reflected in the huge crowds at this week's coffee industry convention in Shanghai, where coffee brands show off their latest espresso machines, grinders, and beans. These are instant coffee powders. Once considered at the lower end of the spectrum, they're getting an upgrade as well.
Our powder fully dissolves in water at any temperature and maximally retains the original taste of freshly ground coffee. Currently, we have 3 product lines that offer over 25 kinds of tastes in instant coffee products. We noticed that our customers will gradually find their own taste and styles. This is a good signal for the coffee market in China.
The brand has a program to recycle these bottles too, a move that resonates with the increasingly green lifestyles of China's younger generation. Yang Chengxi, CGTN, Shanghai.
A reminder of our top stories. The World Health Organization has criticized Europe for its COVID-19 vaccination campaign, calling it unacceptably slow. A third lockdown to battle a third wave. France has ordered further restrictions as infections surge across Europe.
And that is Global Business Europe. Thank you so much for watching. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com and follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're available to watch on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can also find us on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as cgtn.com and the CGTN app. See you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.